The morning sun did not warm the Colosseum stone. It illuminated a stage set for state-sanctioned murder. This was the heart of the Roman world, a place where the line between civilization and savagery was not just blurred, but systematically erased for applause. To understand the arena is to understand Rome itself, not the marble and laws, but the raw, pulsing engine of power and fear that fueled its centuries of dominion. We are about to journey into the shadow of the great amphitheater, to uncover the spectacles that went too far, the atrocities that even some Romans whisper were monstrous. This is not just a story of death. It is a story of how an empire built on discipline learned to worship cruelty, and how that addiction ultimately rotted its foundations. Before we descend into the sand, consider the sheer scale of the operation. The Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater as it was known, could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 souls. On a typical game day, the city's population would swell, its normal rhythms consumed by the anticipation of blood sport. The streets leading to the arena were a river of humanity. Patricians in their fine linens, merchants, soldiers on leave, and the vast, restless plebeian class for whom the games were a rite and a release. The air itself changed, carrying the smells of roasting meat, cheap wine, and the underlying metallic tang of fear emanating from the underground chambers, the hypogeum, where the day's performers awaited their fate. This was a ritual, a civic duty, and a terrifyingly effective tool of control, all wrapped into one. The story of how Rome became synonymous with the arena begins not with a bang, but with a funeral dirge. The first blood spilled in the name of glory wasn't for cheering crowds, but for the dead. In 264 BC, a prominent aristocrat named Junius Brutus Pera died. His sons, determined to honor him in a manner befitting his status, chose a grim tribute. Instead of silent prayers or solemn processions, they armed 3 pairs of slaves and forced them to duel to the death in the Forum Boarium, the city's cattle market. The ground, already stained with the blood and waste of animals, now soaked up human life. This was the munus, a debt, an obligation paid to a ghost for the currency of human suffering. Its origins were far older than Rome itself, rooted in the ancient tribal customs of the Italic peoples. The Etruscans, from whom the Romans borrowed so much, believed in sacrificing prisoners of war at the graves of fallen chieftains, sending armed companions to serve them in the afterlife. For the Samnites, fierce rivals of early Rome, such funeral contests were a sacred tradition. The Romans, ever pragmatic, adopted and adapted. Over centuries, the random sacrifice of a captive evolved into the choreographed combat of chosen men. Burying a man with gold and treasures showed you were wealthy. Burying him with a blood-drenched spectacle proved you were powerful. It demonstrated command over life and death that resonated deeply in a society built on martial virtue. But this funerary rite was about to be weaponized by the state. The Roman Senate, a body of shrewd and often ruthless politicians, saw in these private displays potential that went beyond honoring ancestors. They recognized a powerful mechanism for social control. What if the violence could be directed, its narrative controlled by the state itself? The turning point came in the late 3rd century BC. The Punic Wars had stretched Rome to its limit. The population was weary and social unrest simmered. The state began to officially sponsor gladiatorial games, grafting them onto major religious festivals dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and other state gods. It was framed as an act of supreme public piety, a gift from the elite to the people and the gods. But the intent was pure, unadulterated politics. It was a bargain, a spectacular diversion in exchange for political quiescence. They turned bloodshed into a loyalty test, broadcast live. The gladiators themselves were walking symbols of conquest. They were classified by the armor and weapons of nations Rome had subjugated. The Samnite, with his large, oblong shield and plumed helmet, represented a defeated Italian foe. The Thracian, with his small, square shield and distinctive curved sword, the Sicca, evoked battles on the Danube. The Gaul, with his long sword and helmet, was a reminder of Caesar's Gallic wars. Watching these human symbols of conquered territories bleed and die on the sand was to watch Rome's military victories replayed, slash by parrying slash. Death became a form of living propaganda. As the spectacle's political importance grew, so did its venues. The temporary wooden stands erected in the Forum gave way to permanent, monumental stone amphitheaters. The first of these was built in Pompeii around 70 BC, but the ultimate expression was, of course, the Colosseum, inaugurated in AD 80 by Emperor Titus. These were not just buildings. They were temples to a new state religion where the sacrament was death, and the congregation was the entire Roman populace. Every drop of blood spilled whispered the same, unwavering message. Rome commanded men, armies, nature, and even death itself. When the crowd's thirst for human combat was temporarily slaked, the emperors unleashed the wild. They called it the venatio, the hunt. But to call it a hunt is a profound misnomer. This was no test of survival skill or martial prowess against nature. It was a grotesque, one-sided pageant domination, a living map of the empire's reach. The message was simple. If it exists in the world, Rome can capture it, and Rome can destroy it for its amusement. The scale of the animal slaughter is almost incomprehensible. When the Colosseum opened, Emperor Titus presided over a festival that, according to the historian Dio Cassius, saw 9,000 animals killed. A century later, to celebrate his Dacian triumph, Emperor Trajan would boast of 11,000 animals slaughtered over 123 days. The arenas became a bizarre and bloody zoo of the condemned. Lions and leopards from North Africa and the Middle East, bears from the forests of Britain and Germany, hippos and crocodiles from the Nile, rhinoceroses from sub-Saharan Africa, and even the occasional giraffe, which the Romans, never having seen one, called a camelopardalus, a camel leopard. These creatures were not marvels of nature to be admired, but living, breathing trophies to be destroyed in the most theatrical way possible. They were pitted against each other in unnatural battles. A bear against a bull, a pack of lions against a terrified elephant. Sometimes bestiarii, specialized animal hunters, would fight them, but often the animals were simply massacred in a chaotic, bloody free-for-all. The methods were designed for maximum spectacle. Archaeologists studying animal bones from the Colosseum have found evidence of deliberate starvation and mistreatment. Lions and bears were weakened beforehand to make them less dangerous and to ensure a quicker, more predictable kill. Other times, animals were driven into the arena through complex systems of pulleys and elevators from the hypogeum below, creating a sudden, terrifying surprise for the crowd. The logistics of this carnage were a terrifying feat of imperial will, a dark mirror of the military supply chains that fed the legions. Entire fleets and caravans were dedicated to this grim purpose. Capturing a lion in the Syrian desert was only the first step. It then had to be caged, transported overland to a port, loaded onto a specially modified ship, sailed across the Mediterranean, unloaded at Ostia, and then marched to Rome. The mortality rate in transit was undoubtedly high. This was a global supply chain whose final, brutal destination was the sand of the arena. It was an ecological wrecking ball. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder noted that certain species, like the North African elephant and the Libyan lion, were becoming scarce in their native habitats due to centuries of systematic capture for the games. For some emperors, these hunts became a deeply personal stage for their own megalomania. The most infamous was Commodus, who saw himself as the reincarnation of the hero god Hercules. He would enter the arena dressed in a lion skin and armed with a club and bow. But his heroism was a carefully orchestrated fraud. The animals he heroically slaughtered were often tethered, drugged, or crippled, ensuring a guaranteed victory. He once decapitated an ostrich and paraded before the Senate, holding its head as a not-so-subtle threat. The crowd's applause during these performances was not born of admiration, but of raw, calculated fear. When the emperor hunts, silence could be fatal. But the true, chilling genius of Roman cruelty lay not in scale, but in its deliberate absurdity. The gladiatorial fights we romanticize were rarely the noble duels of equally matched warriors. They were engineered puzzles of violence, designed for maximum suspense, psychological tension, and often humiliation. The Romans thrived on imbalance. Consider the most iconic pairing: the retiarius versus the secutor. The retiarius, the net man, was the most lightly armed gladiator. His equipment was a weighted net, a long trident, and a small dagger. He wore no helmet, only a shoulder guard. His opponent, the secutor, the pursuer, was his mirror opposite, a heavily armored figure whose smooth, rounded helmet with its tiny eye holes was specifically designed to deflect the retiarius's net. The secutor was encased in armor, but his vision and breathing were severely restricted. The contest was a living riddle. Could the agile netman ensnare and kill the lumbering pursuer before being run through by a short sword? It was a brutal game of speed versus strength, a spectacle of suspense that the audience devoured. This love of theatrical mismatch extended to the fate of the lowest classes of participants. Prisoners of war and condemned criminals, who had no training, were often forced into the role of the pygmalius. These were the clown gladiators. They were given a wooden sword, a clear symbol of their futility, in order to fight a fully armed professional killer. Their inevitable, flailing death was not a contest. It was public execution disguised as comedy. The crowd would jeer and laugh as the doomed men stumbled and fell. The imbalance was the entire point, a reminder of the absolute power of Rome over those who defied it. The Romans constantly sought novelty to stave off boredom. Sometimes, a single gladiator will be pitted against multiple opponents. On other days, entire troops clash in chaotic, miniature army battles, turning the arena floor into a swamp of blood, splintered shields, and mangled corpses. When the traditional male versus male combat grew stale, Rome introduced female gladiators, the gladiatrices. While rare and often a source of scandal for moralists like Juvenal, who mocked them, they were a reality. They fought, sometimes against each other, sometimes against dwarves, and sometimes even against wild beasts. Their presence blurred sacred social and gender lines, providing a fresh, transgressive jolt of shock for a jaded audience. Even the armor could be a tool of torment. Some helmets were designed not just for protection, but to disorient, narrowing vision to a slit or muffling sound, forcing the fighter to stumble half-blind and deafen while the audience roared with laughter. By midday, once the morning's duels had soaked the sand and the crowd's initial bloodlust was sated, the violence underwent a sinister transformation. It shifted from sport to something far darker. Didactic theater. This was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, and most famously, Christians were not merely executed. They were forced to perform in elaborate mythic reenactments where the death was horrifyingly, undeniably real. This was execution as moral instruction, a public service announcement written in blood. The punishment was often tailored to the crime. A thief might have his hand cut off before being torn apart by wolves. An arsonist would be burned alive. Those accused of treason or rebellion, the ultimate crime against the state, were reserved for the lions, symbolically devoured by the empire's own power. The scale was, as ever, staggering. During Emperor Trajan's colossal victory celebrations after the Dacian Wars, as many as 10,000 captives may have been slaughtered in the arena over 103 relentless days. This was not random carnage. It was organized, paced like the act of a grim drama, with each death crafted to keep the audience on edge until the next horror arrived.